Entry 22, we're getting close to the end of April. This is Monday, April 27th to Wednesday, April 29th, 1964. And this is a big one. This is another 3-page entry. And it starts with a visit you made to the FBI. Tell us about that.
During the period covered by this entry, Sam Stern and I went to the FBI to have a detailed discussion with respect to its mechanisms for collecting information and sharing it with other agencies. As I mentioned earlier, Sam had visited the CIA in pursuit of that objective, and this was the effort to do likewise at the FBI. The FBI treated our visit very seriously. We were accompanied by officials high up in the organization, and including at some point during the visit with Mr. Belmont, who was really sort of an assistant director and under Hoover. And basically, the FBI personnel who managed the system explained in detail how essentially their files consist of name checks with files on individuals who have come to their attention one way or the other. It was unclear exactly what it took to have a file card about you in their files, but they mentioned that they would basically have to conduct name checks on a regular basis. They said, for example, they suggested, estimated the number of name checks conducted every day was about 10,000 or so, and that the name checks, the filing system is basically a name index rather than a subject index. We asked about the internal organization and learned from Mr. Belmont that they had 10 separate divisions within the agency. They also made clear that when they had an individual case, that it was the agent in the field would operate under the supervision of a person in the agency who had responsibility for 800 to 1,000 cases. So it sounded all very elaborate and detailed, and we questioned them about the use of computers to facilitate access to their files. They responded by saying that they thought that their system was beyond the capabilities of any IBM machine that was presently in existence. That was a sharp contrast with the CIA, where we thought they had begun to use technology more effectively. So after a review of their filing system, its advantages from their standpoint, we had a further meeting about the sharing of the information, and we had a lecture from Mr. Belmont in particular that there was valuable personal information here, and that the FBI had to be concerned with any potential impact on the civil rights of persons when they were deciding whether to provide names to the Secret Service. They had to be careful so that they weren't impinging on the civil rights of persons that might not really be any kind of a threat. And so he was emphasizing the need to draw lines in that area, which is a good point to make. And the question again is whether they did that properly in the case of Oswald. And of course, either at this meeting and at every meeting we had with the FBI, they reaffirmed their position that they knew nothing based on their interviews with Lee Harvey Oswald that required submission of his name to the Secret Service in advance of the motorcade in November of 1963. So it was a very productive meeting. It also these were the people that Sam Stern would visit with in advance of the testimony of individual agents to make sure that the commission had obtained all the relevant records from the Bureau about Oswald.
I was struck by the fact that Mr. Belmont told you that the FBI, this is a quote from page 2, the FBI had altered its criteria in this field subsequent to the assassination, and then expressed his personal view that it may have gone too far because of infringing potentially upon civil rights. So did he give you a sense of what alterations they had made post-assassination?
The only alteration I ever heard of was that they had added the names of defectors who might be identified for any specific visit to a city. In other words, if there was a former defector like Oswald in the city in the future, his name would show up on the list given by the FBI to the Secret Service. Okay. I think that's a fairly limited improvement on the system. And actually, I never was able to keep up and learn whether and to what extent the criteria have been altered over the decades. I know they were altered in terms, but I don't know how effective those changes have been.
The FBI, of course, talks with great pride about their non-computerized system of 5 million index cards, and they talk about their superiority over other agencies. But you'd already seen what the CIA had. You knew that their methods were better. Did the FBI just not know this, or was it just smoke and mirrors because they thought you were a novice? What do you think?
Well, I think there's a good deal of that latter point involved. I'm sure they thought that Sam and I were novices, and to some considerable extent we were. Our judgment about the CIA was, I suppose, based more on what we knew from our professional lives, either in the Justice Department or in private practice, and we sensed that the people at the CIA had about the same level of technology as the major law firms were using at that time.
On the third page, you start talking a little bit about the potential reenactment in Dallas, and this becomes very important. Why don't we chat about that for a minute? Talk about this was something that the FBI and the Secret Service were not supportive of, which is fascinating to me because it was so crucial to determining with precision how the shots impacted President Kennedy and Governor Connally. So give me a sense of their opposition to this.
I think the opposition was sort of not unexpected. Representatives of the CIA and the FBI had worked with the Commission staff, as I've mentioned, in exploring the Zapruder film, exploring the timing of the shots, judging the nature of the wounds, and out of that discussion, as I've mentioned, a group within the staff had developed this alternative view that one of the two bullets hit not only the president but Governor Connally. The Secret Service people were opposed because they thought that the additional information was not needed. They didn't quite see the need for it, and they also emphasized that it would be impossible to tie down with the requisite precision the questions that the Commission staff were posing. So there was a significant difference as to what could be achieved from a reenactment, and if you thought very little could be achieved from the reenactment, then that brought into place more self-protective instincts on the part of the two agencies. I mean, in the case both of the Secret Service and the FBI, reports had already been filed analyzing which bullets hit which person in the vehicle, and they did not want to really support any exploration that might challenge those findings. And they also were concerned about the appearance of a reenactment program in Dallas. They thought it might be bad public relations for the Commission and for the agencies, and stir up a public interest in a way that they were not enthusiastic about. Mm-hmm. And all those concerns, of course, had no persuasive value whatsoever with members of the Commission staff. They did have some impact with Rankin, and we were concerned that the members of the Commission might also share the views of the agencies, namely that not much could be accomplished and that there would be cost and risk associated with the reenactment. So this was one such a discussion. I don't know whether it was extensive. But I think it resulted in a decision to prepare a letter to the FBI requesting that they participate in such a reenactment.
There's one sentence I want to read from the third page, the bottom of the first paragraph. The greatest priority is to determine whether or not a shot at frame 190 in the Zapruder film could have been fired by the assassin from the 6th floor without interference from the tree. That's important because you have to have, at least in order to get the shots within the time frame of the Zapruder film, because the Zapruder film serves as the clock by which we time the assassination, you have to have a shot very early on in order to have the shot behind the Stemmons freeway sign that hits both Kennedy and Connolly. Is that correct? This was essentially a test of the single bullet theory.
Yes, it was, and of course, as you and I have discussed off record, there have been recent explorations that the first shot was before Zapruder reactivated his camera. And if we had adopted that position, there would have been no need to focus so severely on this particular point on the film. But that certainly was the idea, is to try to get more information, if we could, about a first shot. Although, you know, at that time there was no very firm conviction that as to which of the first two shots missed. Everyone knew what the last shot was, but there was a still open question as to whether the first shot had missed or the second shot. And I remember dealing specifically with that issue in the final report with a paragraph as to the probabilities with respect to the first, second, and third shots. And in retrospect, it wasn't decisive, could have been written about in a different manner, but in any event, you're right, the focus was on how early did the process begin, and is that consistent with where the bodies were and the nature of the wounds and so forth.
This is probably as good a time as any to mention that Governor Connolly testified that he was absolutely certain that he and President Kennedy were hit by different shots. Obviously, the commission concluded otherwise. I know it caused some problems later on, but as far as approaching the single bullet theory, was there just an assumption that because Connolly was injured during the assassination that maybe his recollections couldn't be relied upon?
No, I don't think it was due to any injuries he suffered. I think it was a matter of exercising self-confidence, that he was familiar with rifles, and he was confident that he was hit with a separate bullet. It seemed that with the development of more evidence that he might again have looked at his judgment more critically, but he elected not to do so, and as I recall, he maintained that position for the rest of his life, and it had a very important and very unfavorable impact on the conclusions of the commission when they finally turned to that in the last days before the report was completed. In any event, based on this conversation, the Rankin was convinced, because of very strong representations made to him by people like David Ballin and Norman Redlich. Norman wrote a paragraph suggesting that if we went forward with this, we were just opening the door to critics, because if you didn't adopt the single bullet theory, you basically had raised more questions than you'd answered and opened the door to conspiratorial theories of one kind or another.
All right, well, we'll keep talking about this in the next entry.